Right, so the Public Order Bill was passed into law just before the Coronation, signed off into Royal Assent hurriedly by old sausage fingers himself to ensure the police had the full powers of this new law at their disposal to, well, for example, do away with Night Star volunteers, ensuring people were okay on London streets the night before, also to shut down Republic protesters or Just Stop Oil demonstrators from ruining the day, because God forbid protests cause inconvenience. I mean, that's only literally the point of a protest, right? The police came in for a public rinsing in light of their overtly heavy-handed approach they claimed to have been lent on. It's not ever been followed up on that I've seen, but you can only assume the Home Office would have ordered that. Did it come from Suella Braverman herself as Home Secretary? Or was it just her policing minion, Chris Philp? We just don't know. Given it's the Met, it could just be excuses on their part. They've made plenty of those in recent times, after all. Anyway, you would think it was over then, wouldn't you, maybe? Fallen out of news now. Well, au contraire, mes amis, the fight within Parliament has continued. You see, the Tories lost a vote in the House of Lords regarding what counted as serious disruption. They wanted this to mean anything other than minor disruption, so there was no middle ground, no room for circumstance or intent to be questioned. Lots of grey areas here and query, just a black and white cutoff between what counted as minor and what didn't, which, regardless of what might be considered serious disruption, with the restrictions and the sentencing that carries with it. Functionally, this meant peaceful protests, no matter how disruptive, the whole point of a protest, of course, has been protected thus far. This is why you've seen slow marches blocking roads, for example, carrying on. It isn't serious disruption. It might wind you up if you're stuck in it. It might be annoying, but it isn't causing harm. It isn't causing damage. It is not endangering anybody. You might not agree with the tactics. I can't say I'm a fan of them myself, but appreciate for one moment why these people are doing it. Anyway, the Lords removed this bit of the Public Order Bill. It was not allowed to be re-added at third reading before the bill was passed. So the Public Order Bill, intended to crack down pretty much on the likes of Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, wasn't as tough as some in the government might have liked. Well, the Tories haven't given up, and feeling thoroughly affronted at democracy daring to block them from the authoritarianism they wanted ran through, they're now trying to get this passed anyway, but via the back door, with so-called secondary legislation. Now, this is dirty. Secondary legislation is supposed to be used to fill in the gaps, add in the detail of primary legislation, such as the Public Order Bill itself, that has already been passed. It is not there to put back in bits of primary legislation that got voted down. That is totally undemocratic. It's the sort of shit dictators pull. The excuse is this is perfectly legal. It's simply an amendment to existing law, which secondary legislation is obviously there to be used for. For example, a new drug appearing on the black market, for example, can be added into the Misuse of Drugs Act without the need to bother Parliament with it. That is what the mechanism is designed for, not to slip back in something which has already been voted down on in and of itself. The government barred at the time from adding it back in and now thinking, well, sod the Lords, we'll just slide it back in later. Due to the nature of secondary legislation being about the minutiae of an act, minor changes, it doesn't get debated in Parliament. So by going about things in a sneaky way, the government is also avoiding common scrutiny as well, not taking up parliamentary time. It also, crucially, cannot be amended either. So you can see here how this is a quite significant potential abuse of executive power going on. However, the House of Lords has a secondary legislation scrutiny committee, and anything of this nature coming down the line does get looked at by then. And whereas on any normal given day, it would just be a case of nodding through said minor changes, like the drugs example I gave before, they are not happy with this one, and they have flagged it up as something warranting special attention. They have issued a statement on this saying, as well as not justifying the substance of the provisions, the Home Office has not provided any reasons for bringing the measures back in the form of secondary legislation, which is subject to less scrutiny, so soon after they were rejected in primary legislation. We are not aware of any examples of this approach being taken in the past. The House may wish to verify this with the Minister. We believe this raises possible constitutional issues that the House may wish to consider. Functionally, what is happening here is a first. It has never been done before. Suella Braverman, whose bill this obviously is, we've seen enough of her bleating about protesters to know this, is basically trying to use secondary legislation to directly overturn the will of Parliament. The Lords voted this down. It was blocked as a result from being reinserted into the Public Order Bill at third reading. They killed off what Braverman deemed to be serious protest, basically any more than standing on the roadside with a placard in reverent silence. And not just to show it was not designed just as an end to slow walking in roads, but as an end to protest right outside Parliament on Parliament Square, for example. The marches on Downing Street that you see regularly on the TV, all of that would be outlawed. And Braverman is trying to get this through without scrutiny, to get that overturned, despite having had it voted down. Democracy be damned, she wants her way, and won't let a pesky thing like the law or rules, it seems, try and stop her. It could trigger a constitutional crisis, of course. If this function of the House of Lords, the upper chamber of Parliament, can be subverted and functionally the entire House of Lords rendered pointless, that's one heck of a dangerous precedent to set. No checks and balances on the House of Commons anymore. Surely Labour are all set to oppose this in the Lords then, Damo, you might be thinking. And if you recall, you might remember that Keir Starmer ordered his peers to abstain on blocking the passage of this bill, which ought to alarm protesting trade unions, quite frankly, that their party, that they may well be funding, just sat on their hands as this passed. And if you or they wanted a change of heart and some action to be seen from there, you can forget it. They're putting forward a motion of regret, basically saying, we're voting to say this isn't very nice, and that's about it. If passed, it would go down as the equivalent of a strongly worded letter of complaint, having zero impact on the rule change being passed. Weak. Opposition in the Lords, however, does exist, and no less than a fatal motion has been tabled against this legislation by Green Party peer Jenny Jones. This is the strongest opposition the House of Lords can actually take, and if democratic process in Parliament is basically at stake here, no Lord should sit on their hands and not support it. A fatal motion kills off legislation. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and this has been tabled for the 13th of June. These things are so rarely used. The last time a fatal motion by the Lords was triggered was 8 years ago, when the Lords took issue with cuts to tax credits that David Cameron, intent on continuing austerity with his small majority as he had at that time, continuing his war on the poor, and the Lords took issue with it. Got Dodgy Dave so mad he threatened Lords reform even, and almost triggered a mini constitutional crisis over that as he spat his dummy. Now, Cameron was just cruel, but what we're seeing now shouldn't even be legal and undermines the House of Lords totally. Whatever you think of it as a mechanism to hold the government to account, far from perfect, these are unelected people after all, we have enough toothless statutory bodies in this country without the House of Lords becoming yet another. This passing sets a dangerous precedent. A Green peer is leading the fight back. Every Lord should follow suit, frankly, if they want their place to remain relevant. If this fails, the government will be able to pass literally anything they want. Jenny Jones herself has said it. This is a make or break moment for parliamentary democracy. The Lords defeated the government on this issue, and the minister is now acting like a 17th century monarch by using a decree to reverse that vote. What is the point of Parliament if a minister can just ignore the outcome of debates and votes by imposing draconian laws on the public? This is not a one-off, but part of a trend of legislation that undermines parliamentary democracy by giving ministers increasing powers to make, delete, or change laws. In the last 4 years, we have seen a series of skeleton bills passed through Parliament that hand over powers and discretion to ministers to make decisions with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I've waffled on for long enough trying here, frankly. You'd think this would be making headline news, wouldn't you, really? Yeah, but not with our media. Especially with a Green leading the fight back. God forbid they get any coverage whatsoever. I really can't imagine why when they're doing things like this. But that's why you're here, watching independent media instead. And once you've liked, shared, and subscribed to the channel to ensure you are getting the important stuff that the press power media are not interested in, doesn't affect them at all, isn't in their interests, you can see that trying it on is Suella Braverman's stock in trade. Not even stopping short of breaking the law necessarily, as you can see in my video recommendation here. Plenty more content to see with that after you're done. Stick with the channel, hundreds of vids on offer to keep you busy, keep you informed, new stuff out daily. So I'll see you on the next one, I hope. Cheers, folks.